Luther King's rhetoric is very much different from Booker T. Washington. Where Booker T. Washington said, "Cast down your bucket where you are," Martin Luther King is painting a picture of two Americas. What did he say? He said that whites live on a land of plenty, flowing with milk and honey,
Right.
and black men live on a lonely island of despair where we can't find jobs, we can't find this. He painted a very bleak and miserable picture of the black man. Now, what happens psychologically to the man who's being told by their so-called race leader that you're downtrodden, you can't get this, you can't get that? Well, that begins to settle within you a spirit of bitterness, a spirit of despair.
I go by the name of Tommy Guns, and I have a special guest on the show today. He goes by the name of Chad O. Jackson, and I'm just gonna ask you the question up front, like, who is Chad O. Jackson, and just give us a
Well,
brief synopsis of like what you stand for and what you've done and what you plan to do.
thank you for having me on the podcast. As you said, I'm Chad O. Jackson, and I guess first and foremost, I am a born again follower of Christ, and that's basically what I stand for.
Right.
And I talk a lot about I talk a lot about I talk a lot about politics and culture, and which is interesting because I guess the way that I kind of came into the public eye was through politics. Um, I was part of a film that was released in 2020 called Uncle Tom, uh, the oral history of the American Black conservative, uh, which was executive produced by Larry Elder.
Oh wow, I didn't know
Um,
that.
yeah. After the release of that film, I helped co-produce part two, which talks a lot about the civil rights movement and how the civil rights movement was not what many of us think it is. I would venture to say what most of us think it is.
Mm.
It was a movement that helped expand the power of the government at the expense of Americans' freedom, and it did it in the name of race, which was a sensationalized topic at the time. So it was very easy for people to go along with it instead of taking a step back and asking themselves, first of all, is this much ado about nothing? And second of all, what kind of power and control will we be ceding to the government if we were to go the way of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement? And so I talk a lot about that. And what I find is that these things are necessary to talk about because, to the extent that we continue to believe history as it's laid out by our public schools, by our celebrity class and so-called expert class and government bureaucrats and this, that, and the third, if we continue to believe the version of history as they put it out there, then we will continue to move closer and closer to a kind of tyrannical globalist state.
Hmm.
And I believe firmly in the autonomy of the individual, the autonomy of the family. I think that what the founding fathers in America managed to do and managed to put together, as far as the Constitution is concerned, was a work of art.
Mm.
Was a work of art when it comes to human liberty, when it comes to the power of the citizen, the sovereignty of the municipality and the township and the state, the small state. Um, what they labored over, I think, was actually quite genius. And to the extent that we get further and further away from that, we are losing our grip on what true liberty is
Mm.
on this side of heaven. And so, again, to the extent that we believe the version of history as these enemies of uh, of freedom, yeah, I'll put it that way. Uh, as they lay it out, we will continue to give way to social justice movements, to the rise of demagogue politicians,
Mm.
and all the rest, which, in my opinion, helps to bring us closer and closer to that global tyranny that I'm referring to. So I know that said a lot, but these are the kind of things that I talk about and dip and dabble in.
Right. So you think that the civil rights movement or social justice is a ploy for the government to gain more power
Oh,
over the
absolutely.
population?
Absolutely. And it's not just the civil rights movement. Like I said, it's social justice movements in general.
Mm,
When you look at women's suffrage or, what some scholars call first wave feminism,
right.
when you look at second wave feminism, when you look at the civil rights movement, when you look at the LGBT movement, when you look at Black Lives Matter, all of these are social justice movements. And you look at who financially backs and supports these so-called movements and their connections with government, you'll find that it all kind of works in this kind of roundabout way
Hmm.
because these so-called activists, they get the people riled up, they pinch grievances and appeal to sensationalism so they can build numbers because there's strength in numbers.
Right.
And these people take to the streets and demand that something be done about what they're told is a crisis or is chaos. And here along comes a politician and says, if you vote for me, I have the answers to fix what you say is broken. And that answer is almost always more government. And so
Mm,
this is the way that these things work. It's agitation to the highest degree. You get people who are already doing well for themselves by virtue of their own merit, and you get some agitator who comes in, mucks it up, get the people riled up, get the people discontent, dissatisfied, taken to the streets and demanding that the government expands itself. And
mm.
so, yeah, the civil rights movement is very much a part of that.
So you don't think, and I want to expound on that too, but you don't think the civil rights movement was necessary for Black people to reach the point in American society that they have today? You think we could have
No, I
got
don't
here
think it was
without
necessary.
without that?
No, Thomas Sowell talks a lot about this. I've managed to verify this with my own research. My good friend Chuck Littleton, who is somebody, in my opinion, who's up and coming, one of the great researchers of our time. Um, of course, had he written a book by now, I think that more people would know his name, but he hasn't written anything yet. But he's getting there.
Okay.
He's a family man.
Hmm.
Um, there have been others, G. Edward Griffin. There's a lot of people who have been sounding the alarm on what the civil rights movement actually was, including the late Barry Goldwater, the senator out of Arizona.
Hmm.
To the extent that he tried to sound the alarm on what the civil rights movement actually was, he was called a ultra right conservative and a white supremacist and all the things.
Mm.
Never mind the fact that he voted for every civil rights act prior to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which, in my opinion, was unconstitutional. But to your question as to was it necessary, the answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because when it comes to relations between black and white prior to the 1960s, there were huge strides toward progress. And this didn't include the NAACP or any government organization or any activist organization. The reason why blacks and whites were gradually getting along was because of the free market
Mm.
commerce.
Ah.
To the extent that blacks were doing well in business um, and conducting themselves in an upright manner, they were naturally come into contact with white folks through commerce. That familiarity was built within that context, and a lot of these so-called Jim Crow laws were being repealed on the basis that people were finding that they were unfeasible. How
Mm.
can we keep these things up? It's actually costing us more money. Both blacks and whites were finding this to be true, and as a result, these laws were beginning to be repealed. And not only that, if you go even further back, what you'll find is that a lot of these Jim Crow laws that existed in the South were not something that white people did to black folks. Black leaders and white leaders both came together, and together they decided to impose and implement these separation laws, which later became known as Jim Crow laws.
Mm.
But they wanted separation, black leaders as well as white leaders, because what they found is that if we want our people to succeed, then they would have to do so competing with one another, not competing with other cultures. And
Wow.
so people don't look at the true history of separation. And, we look at it as a racist thing that was done to black folks, not realizing that, when you look at the progress of blacks economically, familially, um, in various different facets, the black success was on an upward trajectory from the end of slavery to about the 1960s. And people who were leading the charge with this progress were the likes of Booker T. Washington,
Mm.
who is famous for many things, but for also the saying of casting down your bucket where you are. Don't wait for the white man. Don't wait for this. Don't wait for that. Don't wait for legislation to pass. It's on you to utilize the skills that you have, the talent that you have, whatever that may be, and hone it. And come into yourself, get your legs under you, and to the extent that you do that, don't worry about what white people do or aren't doing or think or don't think about you. Um, People will learn to respect you when you first have respect for yourself. And this was actually true.
Mm.
This was actually proven to be true. He started something called the Negro Business League, which included pharmacists, doctors, dentists, contractors, tradesmen, bankers, all sorts of black professionals. And this existed not only in the South, but in the North too. Philip Payton Jr., for example, he was a stevedore who lived in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And on his off time, he would read old Eastman Kodak camera manuals, and he taught himself to be a photographer.
Mm.
And no, I'm thinking of someone else. I forget his name, but anyway, he moved to North Carolina and was able to uh, be the photographer in this small black town in North Carolina. And he took pictures of uh, of all sorts of black folks for a little over 20 years. And you see these beautiful black and white photos of the people who lived in this town. This was like a lower middle income town, and the people looked like they had respect and dignity about them, unlike what you see coming out of BET and other so-called black programs today.
Right.
But Philip Payton Jr., this is someone else. He was also a part of Booker T. Washington's Negro Business League. He he was actually a realtor. He moved to New York at a time when Harlem was predominantly white. He bought a building there in Harlem, an apartment building, moved black tenants into it, and began to buy even more buildings there in Harlem. And other black realtors began to do the same thing.
Right.
And so you had all these black professionals moving to Harlem, um, on the back of the lessons taught to them by the likes of Booker T. Washington. And so it wasn't this waiting for the government, waiting for the white man to do anything for them. They were actually putting their hand to the plow and making things happen. When
Right.
you get to the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act and Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King's rhetoric is very much different from Booker T. Washington. Where Booker T. Washington said, cast down your bucket where you are, Martin Luther King is painting a picture of two Americas. What did he say? He said that whites live on a land of plenty, flowing with milk and honey,
Right.
and black men live on a lonely island of despair where we can't find jobs, we can't find this. He painted a very bleak and miserable picture of the black man. Now, what happens psychologically to the man who's being told by their so-called race leader that you're downtrodden, you can't get this, you can't get that? Well, that begins to settle within you a spirit of bitterness, a spirit of despair, to where if your dad was a local electrician who everybody called black or white, you see what your dad is doing circa 1960.
Mm-hmm.
But you see this Negro leader, this Negro pastor on television saying, we shall overcome and we're living in despair. And you see all your friends at school going to the marches and going to the sit-ins and going to this and going to that. All of a sudden, your dad, the electrician, looks like a square. And so by the time the 1970s come along, you don't want to carry on the family business that your dad set up, that your dad established. You're going
Right.
to go to the offset of the civil rights movement, which is the Black Power movement. And so you give in to this pro-black identity where you insist on asserting your identity through picketing and protesting and all the things, as opposed to making your way with your hand at the plow like your dad and granddad and great granddad did before you.
Oh
And so
wow.
what we learn to do and starting in the 60s was to be self-assertive, not by anything we're doing with our feet, but rather what we're putting on a picket sign.